Hi, I'm Will Adams and this is Honeybrook Tools and Woodworks. This is the second and final video that I'm doing on the Honeybrook marking gauge. These two videos are part of a larger series that I'm doing on all the tools that I make here at Honeybrook Tools, where I bring you into the shop and show you a little bit of the behind the scenes processes of how I make my tools. If you haven't watched the first video, I would recommend that you go back and check that out. In that video, I walked you through the start of making the marking gauge, from cutting the grooves that receive the brass wear plates, and then installing the brass wear plates. And today I'm going to take you, so this is what it looks like after I've installed the brass wear plates. As you can see, it looks a bit of a mess. It's got some epoxy residue on it and what have you, but that's fine. That's all going to go away. So by the end of this video, we will take this marking gauge from looking like this to looking like this. And this one is not quite finished either. It's got a couple steps left to go. So I'm going to move the camera over to my bench sander, and I'll be right back. Okay, so I've moved over to the bench where I've got my lathe, and I've set up this disc and belt sander. Before I get started on the marking gauge specifically, I want to talk just for a second about tools generally. It's easy to get caught up on wanting the latest and greatest that's out there. There's a reason that tool manufacturers come up with new ideas for tools. It's because they want to sell you something. And I've got nothing against that. I'm a tool maker. But what I want to get at is this sander is literally 30 years old. I bought it about 7 years ago when I first got into woodworking. There are some things about it that I find tedious. Doesn't have hook and loop disc sanding discs. I guess I could convert it if I wanted to spend the time and not complain about it. Excuse me. But it gets the job done. I could go out and spend some money on a newer one that might have some different features that might be a convenience, but the cost benefit to me is how often do I use this tool? And would it be worth shelling out whatever I would have to shell out for a new tool when this one works? So my takeaway from this is, don't let the tools that you've got or your lust for a new tool get in the way of doing the work. This works fine. As I said, there are some things about it that are kind of tedious, but as long as it continues to do the job for me, I'm going to go with it. So I'm going to take this marking gauge head from this to this. Whoops, to this. And as you can see, about all I've got to do in this step is to sand the brass wear strips so that they're smooth with the ends. I could do it with a file. I have done it with a file, but for today's purposes, I'm going to use this. So let me get on my protective eyewear, my dust mask, and we'll get started. Just a second. Okay, so as you can see, it didn't take very long to get that done. One of the reasons that I like using this is I tend to make my marking gauges in batches because there are so many little setup steps that are a little bit fiddly, like setting up, in my case, the table saw to cut these grooves, and then boring the holes for the brass insert and then for the beam. It's just easier to do this in a batch process rather than doing them as one-offs. So with that in mind, if I'm doing a whole bunch of these, I'll do this shaping right over here at the disc sander. So the next thing that we need to do is, as you can see, well, we've cleaned up the residue that was on the end grain here, the epoxy residue. What we need to do now is we need to get the face of the head, we need to get that squared away. As I look at it, the brass wear strips, they're not completely flush over here. And plus I need to just clean up all this epoxy residue. So I'm going to move the camera once again over to a machine that I don't use a whole lot, but is very handy for specific purposes. And that is the drum sander. Let me move the camera and I'll be right back. Okay, so we're over here by the drum sander. Again, this is not a tool that I use a whole bunch, but it is very handy for some specific purposes. This is one of them. Dimensioning inlays, if I have a particular piece of wood that I want to use as inlay, if it's really small, sometimes it's just easier to put it through the drum sander than it is to try to hand plane it. It's a matter of efficiency. And then for this job, you know, if I didn't have a drum sander, how would I do this? I would I would put this in the vise and I would probably draw file it just with a mill bastard until until the wear strips were flush with the head. That would be a little bit tricky just because you want to make sure that, I mean, it's very important that this be square to the hole. So it's possible to do it without a drum sander, but since I've got the tool, I'm going to use it. Now, since this is so small, I have come up with this little push stick that is, you know, it's shaped like the end of the marking gauge head. And the reason for that is because it's so small, if I don't have something to push it through the drum sander, it can get caught and things get ugly quickly. So this is just an expendable piece. I'll have to make another one here pretty shortly because this one's getting kind of thin. But anyway, let me get my mask on. We'll turn on the dust extraction and we'll get going. Now I can tell that these brass wear strips are starting to get pretty hot, so I need to let this cool off for a little bit, because if I don't, it will reactivate the epoxy and then they'll come loose and then we've got a mess. So I'm gonna let this cool for a little bit, then I'll finish it up and then we'll head back over to the bench. So we're back at the bench, and so the next thing I need to do is to sand both the ends of this so that they're nice and smooth. The end grain looks really nice when it's finely sanded and then it's got shellac applied to it. So I'm gonna get my dust mask on here and start going through the grits. Now, before I get started, you may wonder if I'm going to round over the edges by doing this. The answer to that is slightly, but it doesn't matter, and that will become that'll become more clear in the next step. But I don't want to get ahead of myself. So I'm going to start sanding. Okay, so both ends are sanded to 600, and then as you just saw, I finished it off with some 4/0 steel wool. So when I started this, I mentioned that you might have thought, or might not have, that I would round over these edges with the sandpaper. And I said that doesn't really matter, because in the next step in finishing these is to either plane or to file in a chamfer on each one of these edges. And there's both a practical and aesthetic reason. First, aesthetics, I just think a chamfered edge looks a little bit more graceful. And then from a practical standpoint, in hand, I think these sharp edges don't feel all that great in your hand. So just breaking these edges ever so slightly, I think just adds a nice touch to these. So I'm going to start with this file, and I just do this by eye. And as I've said before, you may have heard me say, the more you use your eye, the better your eye gets. I'm a big believer in that idea. And it's easier to hold it, for me, it's easier to hold it than it is to put it into the vise. And to me, when I'm putting these chamfers on, less is more. So you just want, or at least I want, just ever so slight a chamfer on each one of these edges, just so that when you have it in your hand, you wouldn't necessarily know that there's a chamfer, but you would know if there wasn't a chamfer, if that makes sense. And if it's too much, it just looks not right. It just doesn't look proportioned. So again, that's your eye. You need to look at it and think, well, is it pleasing to the eye? Is it too big? Is it too little? Is the angle right? Okay, and then for these edges, I think I will use this little Lee Nielsen Violin Maker's plane. It's a nice little block plane. Works perfectly for something like this. Again, this is one of those things that you would only notice if it wasn't done. Just breaking those edges makes it feel that much better in hand. And then for the front edges, I'd put ever so slight chamfer on that too. And then I just break those edges. Okay. So the next step that I'm going to do, I'm going to set the head aside. I need to do a little bit of work on the brass screw that's going to go in here. So let me grab that and show you what I mean. I'll be right back. I moved the camera in so that you can see up close a little bit better. So when I get these brass screws, they come to me like this, and the ends are machined, and I think you can tell that they're a little bit dinged up. And candidly, I don't think that has a very finished look to it. So I'm going to take this and make it look like this. Now, this is, again, one of those things that you might not notice. You might take it for granted if you received it and it was like this. On the other hand, if you received one that had, these nicks and so forth on it, it just doesn't have a finished look to it. So there's a couple ways that I have done this. I'm going to go into the into the vise, and I've got my file, and I'm just going to go across. And, sometimes things have to get worse before they get better. So that's pretty dinged up now, but it's the first step in a good process. So we've done that. I'm going to take the same sandpaper disc that I was using previously for the ends of the head to the marking gauge, and we're going to start just sanding progressively. And let's see which. I started with 220, we're at 320 now. So I'm finishing off here, well, not finishing, but I'm going to end at 800 grit right here. And then I've got these pads. They all look like this. They go from 1,500 up to 12,000. And these work pretty quickly. So I'm just going to hit this. Actually, it's easier to come out of the vise. Whoops. Starting at the wrong end. There we go. So I'll go through these, each one of these from 1,500 up to 12,000. Then I will head over to my buffer and put this on the buffing wheel to get it where I want it to be. So I'm going to finish this up. You can already see it looks a lot better, at least to my eye. There's still scratches in it, scratch patterns, but I think it looks better than when we started. So I'm going to finish going through this series of pads, abrasive pads. Whoops, that doesn't help. I'll go through these, head over to the buffer, and then I will come back and show you how we're going to finish this up. We are back at the bench, and this is what we look like right now. So I think you'll agree that that looks better than it looked when we started. I've got some residue from the buffing wheel that I'll need to clean up, but that will come in time. Now, the next thing that I need to do with this screw is the stem of the screw is a little bit too long. You'll see what I mean here in just a second. It's a good fit, he said. Might need to file that a little bit. You don't want this to be too tight. You don't want it to be too loose. It needs to be, just right. So this is what I mean by the stem being too long. When I screw this in to the point that it hits the beam, you can see that it's sticking out quite a bit from the edge of the fence. Now, this again is an aesthetic thing. I just don't like the way that looks. I think it looks awkward. So what we're going to do is I will take this over to the bench grinder, and I'm just going to grind down the stem just a little bit so that it will close flush. So I'm just going to eyeball this, get an idea of how much I need to take off. All right, I'll be right back. Okay, let's see how I did. There we go. I just think that looks cleaner. So now, the next thing I am going to do, this particular gauge I'm going to experiment with a little bit in terms of the finish. I most often, well, always have put shellac on these, and will probably continue to do so, but I want to experiment with an oil finish. So what I'm going to do, I can see there's a couple, I need to clean up these edges a little bit. I'm going to do that, and then I've got some oil that's made by Skelton Saws over in the United Kingdom. Wonderful stuff. And I want to play with building up an oil finish and see how that looks and how it feels compared to shellac. So I need to move the camera around a little bit. I'm going to clean up a couple things here, and I will be right back. I'm about to get ahead of myself. Before we can put finish on this, I need to put the maker's mark on it. And I've got this fancy little setup here, an old turn screw, hand screw. That just holds it steady on the bench. We come in here. Okay. Now we're ready to apply some oil. Now, as I said, I'm going to try my hand at, I've used this oil before, but I've never used it as a finish by itself. In other words, I've used it before I've applied shellac just to bring out the grain. But what I want to do is try just building up a pure oil finish. Now again, this is called Skelton Saws Peacock Oil. Shane Skelton is a saw maker, extraordinary saw maker over in the United Kingdom. And he produces 3 different kinds of oil. This one is called Clear Honey. This one is Regal Red. I'm sorry, well, I want to go in order. So Clear Honey, which is what you might expect. It's pretty much just a clear oil. Antique Amber is described as producing a deeper grain popping finish that ages the wood a little bit. And then the last one is Regal Red, which elevates the veins and highlights the grain in darker woods. So this walnut is a darker wood, so I think I'm going to experiment with this one. Shake it up a little bit. So the instructions on this says to sand down the grain to 600 grit, which I've done. raise the grain. I've done that. Application, best applied with a lint-free cloth. Okay, recoat, apply the coat liberally and allow it to penetrate the wood, and recoat every 15 minutes until the wood stays wet after the 15-minute absorbency period. So, we won't stay here for all of that, but we'll show you the results in another video. This is what I'm going to do. Now you can see that oil has penetrated pretty quickly. This walnut is reclaimed walnut, so I think it's got some age on it. So I know it's pretty dry. So I think it will take a fair number of coats to reach that threshold of the wood remaining wet, or just not absorbing any more of the oil. Smells good. And it certainly does complement the grain very nicely, the grain and the color of this walnut. Oops, need to get that side too. So I'm going to continue on here. I won't make you watch all of the applications and waiting, but I will. When I'm finished with this particular marking gauge, I'll share it on another one of the videos that I do, so that you can see how this oil finish has come out. But the initial results, I think it really does bring out the grain and the color in this walnut quite nicely. So I'm eager to see how it looks after the oil finish is built up. And then once all of the oil has dried, I will apply Alfie Shine. That's another British product. Alfie Shine hard wax. This stuff is really great. It's a hard wax. A little bit goes a long way, and it provides a really nice finish. So I'm going to continue on here. I should make the safety announcement that anytime that you're working with oil, make sure that you don't leave your oil-soaked rags sticking around in the shop, because they can spontaneously combust, and that's bad. So that's where I'm going to leave you today. So this is the Brook marking gauge. I have a whole batch of these that I'm finishing up, hopefully this week. And they'll be available for purchase on my website at honeybrooktools.com. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, please click the like button. And as always, if you have any questions or comments, I love responding to the comments that people leave. So just leave them down below in the comment section. And if you haven't already, please consider subscribing to my channel. Thanks for watching.